I walked through the revolving glass doors of the Palmer House Hilton in downtown Chicago, adjusting my perfectly tailored navy suit jacket. The September afternoon sun streamed through the hotel's ornate windows as I made my way toward the grand ballroom, where my sister Emma's wedding reception was already in full swing. 8 years had passed since I'd seen my family, and my stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. I approached the elegant mahogany registration table where my parents Margaret and Robert Walsh stood greeting guests with warm smiles and firm handshakes. The moment my mother's eyes met mine, every drop of color drained from her face, like she'd witnessed a ghost materialize before her. She recovered quickly, her teacher's composure kicking in, as she turned to the cluster of relatives nearby. With a voice steady as stone, she announced, "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Stephen Walsh, a family friend from California." "Dick Halmdat." The words hit me like a freight train derailing at full speed. For 8 years, my parents had told everyone in Cedar Falls, Iowa, that their only son had died in a car accident. My mind reeled backward to that scorching July day 8 years ago when I was 24 years old. I had just graduated from Northwestern University with my computer science degree, armed with dreams bigger than the Iowa cornfields I'd grown up around. Cedar Falls felt suffocating after 4 years in Chicago, but I'd returned home with genuine excitement to share my vision with the two people who'd raised me to believe anything was possible. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, the same oak surface, where I'd done homework for 12 years explaining my business plan to start a tech company. My parents sat across from me like judges, deliberating a criminal case. Dad's weathered hands gripped his coffee mug so tightly I thought the ceramic might crack. Mom kept shaking her head, her graying hair catching the afternoon light filtering through our yellow curtains. "Stephen, you need to think practically." Robert said, his voice carrying the same stern tone he used with his high school history students. "Technology is a gamble. The bank downtown is hiring for their management training program. It's stable, has benefits, and you could work your way up to branch manager in 5 years. But this is my chance to build something revolutionary," I pleaded, spreading out my sketches and business projections across the table. "Cloud storage is going to change everything. Companies are going to need better data compression, and Jake and I have already developed algorithms that could transform the industry." Margaret's lips pursed into that familiar expression of disapproval I'd seen whenever I brought home grades that weren't perfect. "Honey, your father and I have been teaching for 30 years. We know what real careers look like. This startup nonsense is just a phase young people go through. You'll waste years of your life chasing fantasies while your classmates get ahead with real jobs." The conversation escalated quickly. Robert stood up his chair, scraping against the linoleum floor, with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "I didn't work double shifts at the factory while putting myself through college, just to watch my son throw away his education on some pipe dream. You're going to take that job at First National Bank, and that's final. I'm 24 years old." I shot back, my voice rising higher than I intended. "I can make my own decisions about my career. Not while you're living under our roof and depending on us for everything." Margaret snapped, her calm teacher demeanor cracking. "We've sacrificed everything to give you opportunities we never had. The least you can do is show some gratitude and common sense." 3 weeks later, I packed everything I owned into my beat-up Honda Civic. My college roommate, Jake Martinez, had already driven out to California to start looking for garage space we could afford in Palo Alto. As I loaded the last box into my trunk, my parents stood on the front porch, like sentinels guarding a fortress. "If you walk away from this family and this community to chase those ridiculous fantasies, then you're dead to us forever," Margaret declared, her voice carrying across our quiet neighborhood. "Don't come crawling back when you fail and need us to pick up the pieces." I thought she was speaking in anger, using hyperbole, the way people do when emotions run too high. Standing in this hotel ballroom, watching my own mother introduce me as a stranger, I realized she had meant every single word. Emma appeared at my side like an apparition, her wedding dress flowing around her like clouds made of silk and lace. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and her bouquet of white roses trembled in her hands. "But you're supposed to be dead," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the string quartet playing in the background. "They told everyone you died in a car crash in California. Mom even had a memorial service at St. Patrick's." I excused myself from the reception and found refuge in the hotel's dimly lit bar, where crystal glasses caught the amber glow from overhead fixtures. The bartender, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional smile, poured me 3 fingers of Macallan 18 without my asking. My hands shook as I lifted the glass to my lips, the smoky whiskey burning away the numbness that had settled over me like a thick blanket. 8 years of my life flashed through my mind like scenes from someone else's movie. After arriving in California with exactly $3,427 in my checking account, Jake and I had spent our first month sleeping on air mattresses in a cramped garage that smelled like motor oil and broken dreams. The space was barely large enough for 2 folding tables and the collection of secondhand computers we'd assembled from various online auctions. Our breakthrough had come during a particularly grueling week in October, when we'd been surviving on ramen noodles and determination. We were working on data compression algorithms for cloud storage, trying to solve a problem that had stumped engineers at major corporations for years. I remember the exact moment when the solution clicked into place, like a combination lock finally opening after countless failed attempts. Our algorithm could compress data files by 67% without any loss of quality. Something industry experts had claimed was mathematically impossible. Jake and I spent the next 18 months refining our technology while living off credit cards and the occasional freelance programming gig. We called our company Dataflow Solutions, working from that same garage, while bigger companies spent millions of dollars trying to solve the same problems we'd cracked with pure persistence and creative thinking. Microsoft noticed us first. Their senior vice president of cloud services, Richard Coleman, flew out from Seattle to meet us in our makeshift office. He walked through our garage setup, examined our code, and offered us $50 million for our algorithms and our tiny company. I was 26 years old, and suddenly I had more money than most people see in several lifetimes. Instead of celebrating with expensive cars or lavish parties, I channeled every dollar back into my next venture. While Jake decided to travel the world and figure out his next move, I founded Next Tech Industries with a focus on artificial intelligence for healthcare diagnostics. The idea had come to me during a late-night conversation with a doctor I'd met at a coffee shop near Stanford University. He'd explained how many medical conditions go undiagnosed for months or years because subtle symptoms get overlooked by overworked physicians. I assembled a team of the brightest minds I could find, offering equity stakes instead of massive salaries to conserve cash flow. We worked 18-hour days developing AI systems that could analyze medical imaging with accuracy rates higher than experienced radiologists. Our first product could detect early-stage pancreatic cancer with 94% accuracy, potentially saving thousands of lives every year. Google attempted a hostile takeover when our technology started gaining attention in medical journals. They offered $200 million, expecting me to jump at the chance for another massive payday. Instead, I told them our innovations weren't for sale at any price. We went public through an initial public offering that raised $800 million, making Next Tech Industries one of the most valuable healthcare technology companies in the world. At 29 years old, I had become the youngest billionaire in the healthcare technology sector. Forbes featured me on their cover with the headline, "The Garage Genius Who's Revolutionizing Medicine." Business Week wrote a 12-page profile about my journey from Iowa farmland to Silicon Valley success. CNN interviewed me about the future of artificial intelligence in healthcare. Through all of this success, not once had I tried to contact my parents. Their final words to me had cut deeper than any business failure or professional setback ever could. I'd convinced myself that building an empire was the best revenge, that proving them wrong would somehow heal the wounds they'd inflicted. Now, sitting in this hotel bar with whiskey burning my throat and jazz music floating through the air like smoke, I pulled out my phone to check my business emails. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could make decisions affecting millions of people and billions of dollars, but I couldn't figure out how to process the fact that my parents had literally erased me from existence. Mixed in with urgent messages about quarterly earnings and acquisition offers was an email from my assistant back in California. She'd forwarded me a scanned sympathy card that someone had mistakenly sent to our corporate headquarters. The return address showed it was from Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, our old neighbor from Cedar Falls. The card read, "Thinking of you and Robert during this difficult time as you remember Stephen. 8 years feels like yesterday. He would be so proud of the scholarship fund you've established in his memory." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Not only had my parents told everyone I was dead, but they'd been actively maintaining this fiction for nearly a decade. They were receiving sympathy from neighbors and friends who genuinely believed they were grieving parents dealing with the loss of their only son. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I paced around my hotel suite, the city lights of Chicago twinkling 40 floors below like earthbound stars. By 6 in the morning, I was on the phone with Patricia Hoffman, the best private investigator my company's legal team had ever recommended. Patricia specialized in corporate espionage and background investigations, but she agreed to take on what she called the most bizarre family case she'd ever encountered. "Give me 24 hours, she said in her crisp Boston accent. "If there's a paper trail, I'll find it." Patricia delivered results faster than I'd expected. By noon the next day, she was sitting across from me in my hotel suite, with a thick manila folder and an expression that mixed professional fascination with personal disgust. "Stephen, what your parents have done goes far beyond simply telling people you died." She began opening her folder to reveal dozens of printed documents. "They've created an entire fictional narrative about your death and built their social standing around being grieving parents." She handed me a printed obituary from the Cedar Falls Community Newsletter dated September 15th, 8 years ago, just 2 months after I'd left for California. The headline read, "Local graduate dies in traffic accident." Below was a photo of me from high school graduation, along with a completely fabricated story about how I'd been killed in a head-on collision while driving to a job interview in San Francisco. They also staged funeral photos. Patricia continued showing me pictures that made my stomach lurch. There was my mother in a black dress standing next to a closed casket at Elmwood Cemetery, surrounded by flowers and sympathetic neighbors. The casket was empty, obviously, but everyone in town attended the service. But that was only the beginning. Patricia had uncovered evidence that my parents had turned my supposed death into a cottage industry of grief counseling and community involvement. Margaret had written and published a book titled "When Tomorrow Never Comes, A Mother's Journey Through Loss." The book had sold over 3,000 copies locally and established her as the town's go-to expert on dealing with grief and loss. Your mother now charges $75 per hour for private grief counseling sessions. Patricia explained, handing me printed advertisements from the local newspaper. She's also been hired by the county to conduct workshops for parents who've lost children. Her credentials are entirely based on her personal experience losing you. Robert had started a support group called Fathers Facing Loss that met every Thursday evening at the community center. He charged $50 per session and had built a regular group of 8 to 10 men who came weekly to process their own grief with someone who understood their pain. But here's where it gets really problematic. Patricia said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. She handed me a stack of insurance documents that made my hands tremble. They somehow obtained a fraudulent death certificate and have been collecting life insurance money. You had a policy from college that you'd probably forgotten about, a basic $2,500 monthly benefit that was supposed to help with student loans if something happened to you. The numbers made me physically sick. $2,500 per month for 8 years totaled $240,000 in fraudulent insurance claims. My parents had been collecting money for my death while I was building one of the most successful companies in Silicon Valley. There's more, Patricia continued relentlessly. They've established the Stephen Walsh Memorial Scholarship Fund at Cedar Falls High School. They've collected over $18,000 in donations from community members who wanted to honor your memory. The scholarship is supposedly for students pursuing careers in technology, which is incredibly ironic, given that they tried to prevent you from doing exactly that. She showed me photographs from the scholarship award ceremonies, images of my parents presenting checks to local students, while standing next to a memorial plaque with my name engraved in bronze. The plaque featured an inspirational quote about following your dreams that I'd never said, along with dates marking a life that had supposedly ended just as it was beginning. The really twisted part, Patricia concluded, is that they've become local celebrities because of this. Your mother was nominated for the Cedar Falls Community Service Award last year. Your father is being encouraged to run for city council on a platform of family values and community support during difficult times. I stared out the hotel window at the Chicago skyline, trying to process the magnitude of their deception. They hadn't just told people I was dead. They'd constructed an elaborate mythology around my supposed demise and used it to achieve the social status and community recognition they'd always craved. There's one more thing, Patricia said, quietly pulling out a final document from her folder. This might be the most disturbing discovery of all. She handed me a printed email exchange between my parents and a life insurance investigator from 2 years ago. The insurance company had become suspicious when routine database checks couldn't locate any record of my death in California. The investigator had contacted my parents directly, questioning the validity of their claim. Instead of coming clean, my parents had doubled down on their lie. They'd hired a lawyer and threatened to sue the insurance company for harassment during their time of grief. They'd provided additional fake documentation and testimonials from neighbors who could vouch for their loss. The insurance company had eventually backed down rather than face a public relations nightmare of appearing to harass grieving parents. They know you're alive, Stephen. Patricia said, her words hitting me like a physical blow. They've known for at least 2 years, probably longer. When you went public with your company and your photo appeared in Business Weekly, someone in Cedar Falls must have recognized you. But instead of reaching out or admitting their lie, they chose to continue the deception because they were terrified of being exposed as fraudsters. I set down the documents and walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. 40 floors below, people moved through the streets like ants, living their honest lives and dealing with real problems. Meanwhile, my parents had spent 8 years living in a fantasy world where they were tragic heroes, rather than the small-minded people who'd driven away their only son for refusing to abandon his dreams. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stephen, it's Emma. I got your number from the hotel. Can we meet somewhere private? I need to tell you everything." We arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop 3 blocks from the hotel. Emma had changed out of her wedding dress into jeans and a Northwestern University sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked exhausted, like someone who'd been carrying an enormous secret for far too long. "I never believed you were dead," she said immediately, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. "I was only 16 when you left, but I knew something didn't add up." The story kept changing little details that didn't make sense. Emma explained how our parents had controlled the narrative completely from the very beginning. When relatives asked specific questions about my supposed accident, Margaret would break down in tears and Robert would demand that people respect the family's grief and stop asking painful questions. They made it impossible for anyone to dig deeper, Emma continued. If someone suggested visiting your grave in California, Mom would say the location was too traumatic for her to visit. If people asked about your belongings, Dad would claim everything had been destroyed in the accident. As Emma got older and started thinking more critically about their story, she tried to investigate on her own. During her freshman year at the University of Iowa, she'd attempted to search for records of my death through online databases. When she couldn't find anything, she'd confronted our parents directly. They completely lost it, Emma said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Dad screamed at me for over an hour about disrespecting your memory and causing Mom additional pain. Then Mom sat me down and explained that if I ever tried to dig up the past again, they would cut me off financially and emotionally, just like they'd done to you. The threat had worked. Emma was completely dependent on our parents for college tuition and living expenses. She'd been terrified of ending up abandoned and alone, like they'd made her believe had happened to me. But I never stopped wondering, she admitted. 2 years ago, I was in the university library working on a business class project about successful startups. I came across an article in Forbes about young entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, and there was your photo. Emma had recognized me immediately, despite the years that had passed, and the professional styling that came with success. She devoured every article about next tech industries she could find, learning about my journey from that first garage to building a billion-dollar company. I was so proud of you, she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. But I was also heartbroken because I couldn't reach out. I couldn't celebrate your success or tell you that your little sister had been cheering for you from 3 states away. She'd tried once more to confront our parents after discovering the truth. This time their response had been even more extreme. Robert had threatened to disown her completely and leave her with massive student debt if she ever mentioned my name again. Margaret had suffered what appeared to be a panic attack requiring a visit to the emergency room. Oh, that's when I realized they were trapped by their own lie, Emma said. They'd built so much of their identity around being the parents who lost their successful son that admitting the truth would destroy everything they'd built. Emma revealed another devastating detail. Our parents had discovered my real identity and success when my company went public, and my photograph appeared in Business Week magazine. Instead of feeling pride or reaching out to reconcile, they'd panicked about being exposed as fraudsters. Well, won't they? They've been living in constant terror for the past 2 years that someone would connect the dots, Emma explained. Mom barely sleeps anymore. Dad has become obsessed with monitoring news coverage about your company, afraid that someone from Cedar Falls will recognize you in a photo. But the most shocking revelation was still coming. Emma pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages from earlier that day. They found out you were here at the wedding, she said. Mom called me 3 times this morning, completely hysterical. She's convinced that you're going to expose them and destroy their reputation in the community. The text messages revealed the true depth of their desperation. Margaret had written, "You have to warn Stephen that if he tries to destroy us, we'll tell everyone he's mentally ill and that his success is impossible. We'll claim he's an imposter, pretending to be our dead son. They're planning to discredit you," Emma said, her voice shaking with anger. "They've already started reaching out to neighbors and friends, planting seeds of doubt about your mental state. They're going to claim that the real Stephen died 8 years ago, and that you're just some delusional person who's stolen his identity." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their betrayal. Not only had they erased me from existence and profited from my supposed death, but they were now prepared to attack my sanity and success to protect their own lies. "There's something else," Emma said quietly. "They've been using your supposed legacy to plan a political campaign. Mom is running for city council this fall on a platform of grief counseling and youth mental health initiatives. She's positioning herself as the expert who transformed personal tragedy into community service. She showed me campaign flyers that featured my high school graduation photo alongside text about turning heartbreak into hope and building a legacy of love from loss. My parents were literally campaigning on the foundation of my supposed death. Emma, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. I'm going to stop this, not just for me, but for you and for every person in Cedar Falls who's been manipulated by their lies. What are you going to do? She asked, fear and hope mixing in her voice. I'm going to give them exactly what they've been terrified of for 2 years, I replied. I'm going to tell the truth. Back in my hotel suite, I activated the full resources of Nextech Industries for what I privately called Operation Resurrection. My first call was to Harrison Fletcher, the lead attorney who'd handled our IPO and had become one of the most respected corporate lawyers in California. Stephen, this is the most unusual case I've ever handled, Harrison said during our video conference call. But the evidence of insurance fraud is overwhelming. We're looking at multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Harrison's team worked through the night coordinating with law enforcement agencies in Iowa and California. The FBI's white-collar crime division was particularly interested in the case because it involved interstate insurance fraud totaling nearly $250,000. My next call was to Amanda Ross, an investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune, who'd built her reputation exposing small-town corruption and financial fraud. She'd won a Pulitzer Prize for her series on municipal embezzlement schemes in rural Illinois. This story has everything, Amanda said when I finished explaining the situation. Family drama, financial fraud, small-town politics, and a tech billionaire who was supposedly dead. When can we set up an interview? But I had a bigger plan in mind than just a newspaper expose. I wanted to control the narrative completely and deliver justice in a way that would resonate throughout Cedar Falls and send a message to anyone else who might consider similar deceptions. I contacted the superintendent of Cedar Falls Community Schools and proposed a major charitable initiative. Nextech Industries would donate $50 million to establish a state-of-the-art technology center for rural Iowa schools with the flagship location built at Cedar Falls High School. The announcement would be made at a public press conference where I would appear as the founder and CEO of the donating company. We want to give students in rural communities access to the same technological resources available in major cities. I explained to Superintendent Patricia Williams during our phone call. This technology center will include advanced computer labs, robotics workshops, artificial intelligence programming courses, and direct partnerships with major tech companies for internships and job placement. The superintendent was thrilled by the proposal. A $50 million donation would transform not just Cedar Falls High School, but the entire regional education system. She immediately began coordinating with the school board and local officials to plan a major community event announcing the partnership. I specifically requested that the press conference be held at Cedar Falls High School Auditorium, the same location where my parents had been collecting donations for the Memorial Scholarship Fund established in my name. The irony was too perfect to resist. My corporate communications team worked with Amanda Ross to coordinate media coverage. The Chicago Tribune would break the story simultaneously with the press conference, and we'd arranged for CNN and Fox Business Network to cover the event live. The story would reach millions of people within hours of the announcement. But the night before the press conference, my carefully orchestrated plan faced an unexpected complication. Emma called me in tears, her voice barely coherent through her sobbing. Stephen, they know something's happening, she gasped. Mom and Dad have been calling me all day completely panicked. They somehow found out about the press conference tomorrow. My parents had apparently heard rumors through the local school board grapevine that a major technology company was planning a significant donation announcement. Given their obsessive monitoring of any news related to tech companies, they'd immediately suspected my involvement. They're desperate, Emma continued. Mom called me an hour ago, begging me to contact you. She wants to meet before the press conference to work something out. She's terrified that you're going to expose them publicly. What did you tell them? I asked. I told them I don't have your contact information and that I haven't spoken to you since the wedding. But Stephen, they're talking about doing something drastic. Dad mentioned something about calling the press themselves to claim that you're mentally ill and that the real Stephen died years ago. I realized that my parents were about to make their final desperate gamble. They would try to destroy my reputation and credibility before I could expose their fraud. In their twisted logic, they believed that discrediting me was their only chance of survival. Emma, I need you to do exactly what I tell you, I said, my mind racing through contingency plans. Tomorrow morning, I want you to call Mom and Dad and tell them that you've been contacted by someone claiming to be me. Tell them this person wants to meet with them privately before the press conference to discuss keeping family business private. Where do you want them to meet? Emma asked. The parking lot behind First National Bank at 10 in the morning, 1 hour before the press conference begins. Tell them to come alone and not to contact anyone else about the meeting. It was time for the final confrontation. After 8 years of building an empire while living as a ghost in my parents' fictional narrative, I was ready to reclaim my identity and deliver the justice that had been 8 years in the making. Stephen, Emma said quietly, are you sure you want to do this? Once you go public with everything, there's no going back? Emma, I've been dead to them for 8 years, I replied. It's time for Stephen Walsh to come back to life. The morning of September 23rd dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that makes Iowa autumns feel like nature's masterpiece. I arrived in Cedar Falls at 9:30 in the morning, driving a rented black SUV through the familiar streets of my childhood. Nothing had changed much. The same white farmhouses lined the same tree-dotted roads. The same grain elevators rose like monuments against the horizon. The same sense of smallness that had driven me away still hung over everything like morning fog. I parked behind First National Bank, the same institution where my parents had demanded I work 8 years ago, instead of pursuing my entrepreneurial dreams. The irony of meeting here wasn't lost on me. This was where they'd wanted me to build a stable career. Never imagining that their son would instead build a billion-dollar company that would eventually make national headlines. At exactly 10 o'clock, my parents' silver Honda Accord pulled into the parking lot. I watched through my tinted windows as Margaret and Robert Walsh stepped out of their car, looking around nervously like fugitives meeting a blackmailer. Margaret wore a navy blue dress that made her look older than her 58 years. Robert had dressed in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to parent-teacher conferences and church services for as long as I could remember. I stepped out of my SUV and walked toward them. The moment they saw me, both of their faces went through the same series of expressions: shock, fear, recognition, and finally a kind of desperate calculation as they tried to figure out how to handle this impossible situation. "Hello, Mom. Hello, Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. "I think we need to talk." Margaret started crying immediately, not the gentle tears of a mother reunited with her son, but the panicked sobbing of someone whose world was about to collapse. Robert stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "Stephen," Margaret finally managed to say, "you have to understand we never meant for things to go this far. It started as just telling a few people that you'd moved away permanently, and then it just grew into something we couldn't control. You told everyone I died," I said flatly. "You held a funeral. You collected insurance money. You built your entire social standing around grieving my death while I was building a company that's now worth billions of dollars." Robert found his voice and immediately reverted to the stern, controlling tone that had driven me away in the first place. "Now you listen to me, young man. What you've done is illegal. You can't fake your own death and then show up years later expecting everything to be forgiven. We were protecting ourselves from the legal consequences of your actions. The audacity of his statement was breathtaking. In his twisted logic, I was the criminal for surviving my own supposed death. Dad, I never faked anything. You told everyone I was dead. I've been living my life openly in California, building a company, paying taxes, existing in plain sight. There are thousands of articles and interviews about my work. I'm on the cover of Forbes magazine. Those articles could be about anyone, Margaret said desperately. You could be some con artist who's stolen our son's identity. The real Stephen died 8 years ago. I realized in that moment that they'd convinced themselves of their own lie so thoroughly that they genuinely believed their version of events. They'd lived with their deception for so long that acknowledging the truth would require admitting 8 years of fraud, theft, and emotional manipulation. I have something to show you, I said, pulling out my phone. I showed them the Forbes cover story, the Business Week profile, and dozens of other articles featuring my photograph and detailed information about my background, including my graduation from Northwestern and my childhood in Cedar Falls. Anyone can fake documents these days, Robert said, his voice growing more desperate. This proves nothing. Then let's go to the press conference, I replied. In 30 minutes, I'm going to stand in front of the entire community and announce a $50 million donation to build a technology center at the high school. The same high school where you've been collecting money for a memorial scholarship in my name. The color drained from both of their faces as the full scope of their situation became clear. They were about to be exposed as fraudsters in front of the entire community that had spent 8 years offering them sympathy and support. Stephen, please, Margaret begged, grabbing my arm. We'll pay back the insurance money. We'll tell everyone we made a mistake. Just don't destroy us publicly. Think about what this will do to Emma. Think about what this will do to our family's reputation. You destroyed our family 8 years ago when you chose your pride over your son, I said, gently removing her hand from my arm. Emma has spent years believing her brother was dead because you were too stubborn to admit you were wrong about my dreams. I started walking toward my SUV, then turned back for one final statement. The press conference starts in 25 minutes. You can either be there to face the truth with whatever dignity you have left, or you can stay here and let the community find out through news reports. But either way, the truth is coming out today. As I drove toward Cedar Falls High School, I could see them in my rearview mirror, standing in that parking lot like two people watching their world end. Part of me felt genuine sadness for the parents who'd raised me and taught me to work hard and dream big before their own limitations and fears had poisoned everything we'd built together. The high school auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Local residents filled every seat while overflow crowds gathered in the lobby and gymnasium to watch on closed-circuit television. Reporters from Chicago, Des Moines, and Cedar Rapids had set up cameras and lighting equipment. The superintendent had arranged for a live stream that would broadcast the announcement to schools throughout Iowa. As I walked onto the stage where I'd graduated as valedictorian 12 years earlier, I could see my parents slip into seats in the back row. Margaret's face was red and puffy from crying. Robert sat rigidly upright, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles working in his cheeks. "Good morning," I said, stepping up to the podium where I'd delivered my graduation speech about following your dreams no matter how impossible they might seem. "My name is Stephen Walsh, and I'm the founder and CEO of Nextech Industries." A murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. Some people had heard of my company through business news coverage, but most had no idea that the billionaire tech entrepreneur addressing them had grown up in their community. I'm here today to announce that Nextech Industries is donating $50 million to establish the most advanced educational technology center in rural America right here at Cedar Falls High School. The auditorium erupted in applause and cheers. Superintendent Williams beamed as she accepted the oversized ceremonial check. Local officials lined up to shake my hand and thank me for my generosity. But then I moved to the second part of my announcement, the part that would change everything. Some of you might remember me from when I was growing up here, I continued. I graduated from this high school 12 years ago and left for college at Northwestern University. After graduation, I moved to California to start a technology company, despite my parents' wishes that I take a safer, more traditional career path. The murmur grew louder as people started connecting the dots. Several audience members turned to look at my parents whose faces had gone completely white. However, some of you might be surprised to learn that according to my parents, Margaret and Robert Walsh, I've been dead for 8 years. The auditorium fell into stunned silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the polished wooden floor. For the past 8 years, my parents have told this community that their son died in a car accident in California. They held a funeral service, established a memorial scholarship fund, and have been collecting life insurance benefits based on my supposed death. Amanda Ross was furiously taking notes from the press section, while television cameras captured every moment of the revelation. In the back row, my mother had buried her face in her hands, while my father sat motionless like a statue. They did this not because they genuinely believed I was dead, but because they couldn't accept that their son had chosen a different path than the one they'd planned for him. Rather than admit they'd been wrong to try to control my choices, they found it easier to tell people I was dead. I paused, letting the full weight of the revelation sink in throughout the auditorium. People were turning to stare at my parents, their expressions shifting from shock to anger to disgust. But I'm very much alive, as you can see. And despite everything that's happened, I still believe in this community and the values that shaped me growing up here. That's why I'm donating this technology center not as revenge, but as proof that when we support young people's dreams instead of limiting them, incredible things become possible. The Iowa State police officers I'd coordinated with were already moving toward the back row. They arrested my parents on federal charges of insurance fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy as the cameras rolled, and the audience watched in stunned silence. The Technology Center will be called the Emma Walsh Center for Truth and Resilience, I announced, named after my sister who spent 8 years believing her brother was dead, but never stopped hoping that someday the truth would come out. As my parents were led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 8 years, the weight of their disapproval finally lifting from my shoulders. I was no longer the disappointing son who'd chosen dreams over stability. I was no longer the ghost they'd created to justify their own limitations. I was Stephen Walsh, and I was finally completely alive. 6 months later, I returned to Cedar Falls for the grand opening of the Emma Walsh Center for Truth and Resilience. The spring morning was warm and bright, with the kind of gentle breeze that makes Iowa feel like the most peaceful place on earth. The Technology Center had transformed the high school campus with gleaming new buildings that looked like something from a university rather than a rural school district. Margaret and Robert Walsh had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of insurance fraud. They were also required to pay full restitution, including the $240,000 in fraudulent insurance claims plus interest and penalties. The community had rallied around Emma and me, expressing shame at how easily they'd been deceived, but also pride in what their hometown had produced. Emma had used her share of my gift to establish the Second Chances Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides support for young adults who've been cut off from family support due to conflicts over their life choices. Her organization had already helped over 200 people across Iowa, providing everything from temporary housing to career counseling to legal assistance. She was engaged to her college sweetheart, David Martinez, and I would be walking her down the aisle at their wedding next month. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Jake Martinez, my original business partner, was David's older brother. Life has a way of creating connections that seem impossible until they happen. The Technology Center had already transformed educational opportunities throughout the region. Students were developing mobile apps, learning artificial intelligence programming, and starting their own small businesses with support from mentorship programs I'd established. 3 high school seniors had already been accepted to Stanford and MIT with full scholarships funded by Next Tech Industries. I'd hired 12 graduates from Cedar Falls and surrounding communities for our new Rural Development Division, proving that innovation and technological advancement didn't require abandoning small-town values or family connections. These young people were now earning Silicon Valley salaries while living in Iowa, contributing to their communities instead of leaving them behind. Standing in the center that bore my sister's name, surrounded by students who reminded me of myself at their age, I reflected on the profound life lessons this journey had taught me. Success means absolutely nothing without authentic relationships built on truth and mutual respect. My parents' obsession with social status and their terror of my unconventional path had led them to literally erase me from existence. But their betrayal had also freed me to discover what I was truly capable of achieving. The greatest tragedy wasn't the money they'd stolen or the lies they'd told about my death. The real loss was the 8 years of family connection we'd all sacrificed to their pride and fear. Emma had grown up believing her brother was dead. I'd built an empire without anyone from my childhood to share the victories and challenges. My parents had lived in constant anxiety, terrified that their deception would be discovered. But sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are actually the ones most threatened by your potential for growth and success. When someone tries to limit your dreams to match their own limitations, they're not protecting you from failure. They're protecting themselves from having to confront their own fears and missed opportunities. The most important decision I'd made wasn't choosing to start a company or refusing to take a safe job at the bank. The most important choice was deciding to pursue growth over comfort, truth over approval, and authenticity over the safety of meeting other people's expectations. Being declared dead by my parents had actually taught me how to truly live. When you're freed from the need to earn approval from people who will never understand your vision, you discover reserves of creativity and determination you never knew existed. The garage, where Jake and I started Dataflow Solutions, became sacred space because it was the first place I'd ever worked without trying to prove anything to anyone except ourselves. Building a billion-dollar company was satisfying, but the real victory was much simpler and more profound. I'd learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. Real family consists of people who celebrate your successes, support your dreams, and love you enough to tell you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Emma had become that family for me, along with Jake, my employees at Next Tech, and the community of entrepreneurs and innovators who understood that changing the world requires taking risks that conventional wisdom says are impossible. The Emma Walsh Center for Truth and Resilience would serve as a daily reminder to every student who walked through its doors that their dreams matter more than other people's fears. When adults tell you that your goals are unrealistic or impractical, they're usually revealing more about their own limitations than about your potential. The Technology Center's mission statement, carved in granite above the main entrance, captured everything I'd learned from this journey. Truth builds bridges, while lies build walls. Resilience transforms setbacks into comebacks. Dreams pursued with integrity create possibilities that benefit everyone. My parents had tried to bury my dreams along with my supposed death, but dreams don't die when people stop believing in them. They just wait patiently underground until someone with enough courage and persistence digs them up and gives them room to grow. The most satisfying part of this entire experience wasn't the revenge or vindication. It was the peace that comes from knowing that every relationship in my life is now built on complete honesty. The people who know me today know exactly who I am, what I've accomplished, and what I still hope to achieve. There are no more secrets, no more lies, and no more need to prove anything to people who will never understand. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is their rejection, because it forces you to discover who you really are when you're not trying to be who they want you to be. My parents' decision to declare me dead was the most painful and liberating experience of my life. Standing in this technology center watching students work on projects that might change the world, I realized that being resurrected from my own supposed death had taught me the most important lesson anyone can learn. The only approval that really matters is the approval you give yourself for pursuing your dreams with integrity and using your success to lift up other people. Have you ever had family members or people close to you try to limit your dreams because they were afraid of your potential? What would you do if the people who were supposed to support you actually became the biggest obstacles to your success? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of your own struggles with family expectations versus personal dreams, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear that their dreams are valid, even when the people closest to them don't understand. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming obstacles and building success on your own terms. Thank you for taking this journey with me today. Remember that your dreams are worth fighting for even when that fight requires you to stand alone for a while. Sometimes the most important resurrections happen not when others declare us alive again, but when we finally give ourselves permission to fully live.